The Bavarian Soviet Republic existed for only a few months in 1919 before being absorbed by the Weimar Republic. However, if she had survived, the world could have changed significantly. Although this seems unlikely, the consequences of such a scenario would be enormous. For example, I do not see how Germany could start a war, as it would barely border Austria, and I do not think the Munich Conference would have gone the same way as in reality. Thus, World War II would have been significantly different. The history of the Bavarian Soviet Republic is brief but quite interesting. For them, many things went wrong, so I want to tell how they could survive and establish a communist state in southern Germany, deeply connected to the Soviet Union. On November 8, 1918, the People's State of Bavaria was founded, remaining part of Germany after the upheavals of the German Revolution and the collapse of the central government. Munich was offered to follow the Soviet path, and thus the Bavarian Soviet Republic was proclaimed, while the People's State of Bavaria fled to Bamberg. However, the new state turned out to be unsuccessful, as the government lacked political or administrative experience. This resembles the situation of many Eastern European countries today. The territories they claimed were actually limited to Munich, and some parts of the countryside that were hard to control. The Bavarians were actually against the Soviet Republic, as many believed Bavaria was the least suitable place in Germany for communism. The locals were mostly conservative and preferred the king, which contradicted the goals of the Soviet Republic. They were also deeply Catholic, which did not align with the ideals of Soviet power. In particular, one of the main churches in Munich was seized and turned into a revolutionary temple, further exacerbating the conflict with the Catholics of Bavaria. The Bavarian Soviet Republic made many mistakes, alienating those it controlled. For example, it angered conservatives by electing a convicted criminal as the police chief of Munich. Moreover, the Commissioner of Foreign Affairs had several stints in psychiatric hospitals and even declared war on the Weimar Republic and Switzerland, which was not taken seriously as his government was not recognized. He declared war on Switzerland because they refused to provide 60 locomotives to the Soviet Republic, which angered Dr. Franz Lippe so much that he planned to declare war. Now that you can understand who governed this government, you can realize why it lasted only 27 days. This government, composed of convicted criminals and psychopaths, quickly fell apart, replaced just 6 days later by the German Communist Party, led by Yevgeny Levin, a Russian German. After the Bolsheviks came to power, they began to implement a more radical version of communism. During this time, the Bavarian Red Army was formed, realizing that the central government might attack them. Therefore, the Bavarians decided to fight for their independence. The army consisted of factory workers, which exacerbated the food shortage in the newly established state. All workers were also given military training. Funds for this were obtained through the confiscation of cash, food supplies, and weapons belonging to private individuals. Aristocrats and representatives of the middle class were arrested and taken hostage on Lenin's orders. This situation, combined with severe food shortages, made the Bavarian Soviet Republic extremely unpopular among the locals, while the exiled Bavarian Prime Minister Johann Hoffmann called on all Bavarians to voluntarily join the army and fight against the Bavarian Soviet Republic, which he described as terrorized by the Russians. His call was quite successful, and people began to join the government forces planning a march on Munich to return Bavaria to Germany. The two sides clashed in battle on the outskirts of Munich. On Hoffmann's side, 8,000 soldiers fought against 30,000 soldiers of the Soviet Republic. This was the first and only victory of the Bavarian Red Army, as after this, Johann Hoffmann received 20,000 troops from the Freikorps to continue his struggle. The Freikorps employed brutal methods and destroyed anyone who stood in their way, unjustifiably increasing the number of victims. These soldiers surrounded Munich and then advanced into the city. The battles were fierce and involved flamethrowers, heavy artillery, armored vehicles, and even airplanes. The Bavarian Soviet Republic collapsed, and its members were imprisoned or destroyed. This ended the socialist experiment, and Hoffmann's government returned, forming the Free State of Bavaria within the new Weimar Republic. Considering all this, it can be said that the Bavarian Soviet Republic did everything wrong. To survive, I will need to act completely opposite to what they did. The first step to increasing the chances of survival for the Bavarian Soviet Republic will be to stop hiring convicted criminals and to try to please the people, which will be the right direction. This means that the more radical cabinet of Levin must take power into its own hands as soon as possible. The second reform I would propose is cooperation with the Catholics instead of immediately suppressing them, which would ensure the support of Catholics who controlled much of the countryside and potentially improve the food shortage situation. Thirdly, Yevgeny Levin should establish closer cooperation with the German Communist Party, as their support could be crucial for survival. The German Communist Party was not popular in 1919. In the elections, they received only 2.1% of the votes, but just 4 years later, in 1924, this figure increased to 12.6%. Indicating a sharp rise in their support. During the economic crisis between 1921 and 1923, I would propose a reform aimed at preserving the Bavarian Soviet Republic, specifically to prevent the Weimar Republic from uniting with the Freikorps, an unpredictable paramilitary organization. As I mentioned, the Freikorps sowed chaos and terror among their own population. The number of victims significantly increased during the recapture of Munich, when any civilian suspected of communist or anarchist views could be executed with impunity. Not using the Freikorps is not such a crazy idea, considering that the Spartacus uprising occurred just 3 months before the formation of the Bavarian Soviet Republic. During this uprising, the Weimar Republic also used the Freikorps to suppress the rebellion, and although it was successful, the Freikorps acted with extreme brutality, taking the lives of many innocent citizens. In this alternative reality, the government of the Weimar Republic decides not to send the Freikorps, fearing they would provoke chaos in Munich, leading to Bavarian resistance and complicating the state's entry into the Weimar Republic. Moreover, the Weimar Republic will try to disband the Freikorps, as they acted almost independently and posed a threat to the stability of the Weimar Republic. Exact numbers are hard to find, but the Freikorps numbered around 500,000. Which was more than enough for the army of the Weimar Republic. Thus, the Freikorps could have carried out a coup that might have been successful. For these reasons, I would suggest that the Weimar Republic not interfere in the affairs of the Bavarian Soviet Republic, as it would be a serious historical mistake. As I mentioned, Hoffmann's monarchists and the Bavarian Red Army clashed at Aix, where the Bavarians emerged victorious. Then Johannes Hoffmann received 20,000 Freikorps soldiers for his needs, which subsequently led to the destruction of the Bavarian Soviet Republic. With the proposed reforms, the Bavarian Soviet Republic could have become significantly more effective, and without the confrontation with the Freikorps, it could have ensured the stability of its state. I have already said that the Soviet Republic initially befriended the Catholics, which helped gain support for the new state from the rural population. As a result, I see the Bavarian Soviet Republic gradually expanding its borders beyond M, including the countryside, which would help solve food problems, as by that time farms would likely have been privatized. When the Weimar Republic could muster an army to fight the Bavarian Soviet Republic, an economic crisis would already erupt in 1921, leading to hyperinflation and other troubles for the Weimar Republic. The failure to pay reparations led France and Belgium to jointly occupy the Ruhr, where a significant part of German industry and reserves of coal and other raw materials were located. What happened after this is not so important, but I believe this incident could have happened much earlier, perhaps at the beginning of 1920. This means that from April 1919, when the Bavarian Soviet Republic was established, until the crisis in the Ruhr at the beginning of 1920, only 1 year passes. If the Bavarian Soviet Republic manages to last just a year, which is more likely if the Weimar Republic does not deploy the Freikorps, they will likely secure their independence when the crisis in the Ruhr breaks out. This is due to the fact that the Weimar Republic government was already in huge debt and had again lost its lands under French occupation, so the people would prefer to leave Bavaria alone, rather than trying to reclaim the Ruhr. The Weimar Republic cannot justify significant expenses to suppress the Bavarian Soviet Republic amidst the ongoing hyperinflation crisis. Thus, if the Bavarian Soviet Republic can last just a year after its creation, it will likely strengthen its power and eventually assert its territorial claims, excluding the Palatinate, as France will never allow a communist state at its borders. I understand that this may seem a bit unrealistic, but in reality, surviving under such conditions was extremely difficult, as the country existed for only 27 days under the rule of convicted criminals, governing a people with opposing views. Nevertheless, I do not think this idea is too absurd, and I believe that my turning point, which is to not send the Freikorps and wait for the crisis in the Ruhr, is quite reasonable. There is a possibility that France may invade the Bavarian Soviet Republic, as this new state will not pay reparations to France. But I believe this is unlikely given the political situation in France. They will not be ready to enter a new war for any reason. Therefore, the Bavarian Soviet Republic will be successfully established and consolidate its lands in 1921, even before the end of the Civil War in the Soviet Union. Munich may become the first capital of the communist world, and then, perhaps in 1924, it will become Leningrad. The Soviet Union and the Bavarian Soviet Republic historically collaborated closely. Some of Lenin's decrees were implemented in Bavaria, enhancing the ties significantly. The country will be led by Yevgeny Lavin, a Russian German, which will further improve relations between the two states. This communist state in the heart of Europe will be a thorn in the side for its neighbors, as it will have no real allies. Of course, the Soviet Union will actively support this country, but they are far away, and in the event of an attack by the Weimar Republic, the Soviet Union will be unable to provide any assistance, as it does not border any of these states. Thus, the Bavarian Soviet Republic will find itself practically isolated, and I have no doubt that some countries will impose an embargo and decide to seize their trade, at least in the beginning, immediately after its creation. I want to go south and tell what I think will happen to Austria, as I see that their history may change quite a bit. Immediately after the end of the Great War, Austria-Hungary collapsed, and from its remnants emerged the Republic of German Austria with territorial claims. Their goal was to secure their independence in these territories and then unite with Germany, but this was prohibited by the Treaty of Versailles. In practice, they controlled only a tiny part of the claimed territories, as part of Silesia was under Czechoslovak control. The south was administered by Italy, while northern Slovenia was controlled by Yugoslavia. The Austrians wanted to unite with Germany, as the Austrian part was in ruins after the collapse of Austria-Hungary. Their industry was now in Czechoslovakia, food supplies in Hungary, and the coastline was controlled by Yugoslavia. Thus, the Austrian state experienced particularly strong difficulties, and they sought to unite with Germany to improve their internal situation. I mention this because there is a small chance that Austria will decide to unite with the Bavarian Soviet Republic. In the 1920 Austrian parliamentary elections, the Social Democratic Party of Austria received 35.99% of the votes and was a main supporter of the idea that Austria should join the Bavarian Soviet Republic. This party shares the same ideology as the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which ruled the Weimar Republic, so it's not surprising that these ideologically similar countries with a common language would want to unite, this time with the Bavarian Soviet Republic. The political situation in Austria may change, and it is quite possible that Austrians will want to unite with the Bavarians and become equal partners. But not many will wish to be part of the Soviet Republic. The unification of Austria with the Bavarian Soviet Republic is not such a crazy idea, as Vienna at that time was often called Red Vienna, due to the influence of the Social Democratic Party. However, at the beginning of the 1920s, both the Bavarian Soviet Republic and Austria were experiencing serious economic difficulties. I assume that the Bavarian Soviet Republic would be in a slightly better position, as it would no longer have to pay reparations and could receive Soviet aid, becoming more prosperous than the Weimar Republic. This is certainly related to the fact that in 1923, the Weimar Republic was experiencing one of the largest economic crises in the world. But this does not mean that the Bavarian Soviet Republic was in economic prosperity. Rather, its neighboring countries were in an even worse condition. Later, the Weimar Republic may transition to the Third Reich with the appointment of a man who closely resembles this cat as Chancellor of Germany. Perhaps Germany is less prone to ultranationalism, but I believe it will still happen, although the ultranationalists will be significantly weaker. Let me explain. Historically, after the defeat of the Bavarian Soviet Republic, the population of this region became sharply anti-communist. As I mentioned earlier, the country was ruled by convicted criminals who declared wars and caused famine. The Bavarians not only became fierce opponents of communism, but their region also became fertile ground for far-right ideologies like National Socialism. Moreover, after the socialist events, a split occurred in the left parties, allowing the National Socialists to quickly come to power. The chart shows how rapidly the Nazis seized power. This time, it will be different. The Nazis may come to power, but the process might take a little longer. This is one perspective on the situation, but there is another. The National Socialists could come to power around the same time as in our history, due to the hatred of communism and Jews. The Bavarian Soviet Republic was communist and governed by many Jews. The Nazis may promise to destroy this movement and unite Bavaria with Germany, punishing the guilty. The Austrian artist blamed the fall of the Weimar Republic on the Bavarian Soviet Republic, claiming that the Weimar government was too busy fighting the Bavarians to make the payment to France in 1920. He would claim that Bavaria caused the hyperinflation crisis, although that is not true. The existence of the Bavarian Soviet Republic could make the National Socialists less popular, or, conversely, more popular. I believe both theories are valid.